Welcome
to
Authors
Anonymous
with Carolyn Rosa Potts. She's trying to take my thunder.
and Mirabal. Yeah, we're just really excited about today's episode. AR, tell the good people what we're doing.
This is episode 9. This is the semi-season finale. Okay? We are finally doing what we've been talking about. We're taking everything that our episodes have been about, all the topics, all the genres, all the things that we've given, all the tips that we wish we knew before we started writing. And we're putting all of these together to make a critique of a fellow author's writing. This week, we're doing Adam Gaffen.
Woo! Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam. He's a huge friend of the podcast. I think he actually has the highest amount of repeat visits on the podcast out of any author. Awesome guy. He is the author of the Cassidy Chronicles. I think there are 4 books out. All 4 of them have an audiobook out. He has a short story novella coming out that kind of ties into the whole world. There's no world building, very sci-fi guy. If you're into the classic Battlestar Galactica, sci-fi, what's the one with the people, Star Trek, that type of, if that is your genre, give this man a look.
Yes.
Great guy, great person, great author. But today we're actually going to go in onto one of his short stories called Press Play to Continue.
Yeah, okay, so I would describe it as dystopian. Definitely has
apocalyptic for sure.
Yeah, apocalyptic. Yeah, apocalyptic. Now I can't say that word. So if that's your genre, definitely check it out. And right off the bat with the title, Press Play to Begin, it's very evident as soon as you open the first page why it's called this title. So I'm just going to read through the notes that I had taken when I was reading this, and then AR and I are going to come together at the end and talk about the overarching kind of themes and tips and things like that. So
now, before Carolyn dives into everything, sorry to take you in there, but
okay. The tension is building.
One of the things that we're going to go in here is we're not just going to glaze over things, but we're going to actually apply all the things that we have talked about throughout our previous episodes and talk about it here, good and bad. We're not going light here. We're going 100%. We're going to point out the things that could have been better so that you know for the future, and point out the things that were well so you know how to mimic them in the future. Now, without any further ado, Carolyn's notes, hit me. Hit the people.
All right, so it starts when you open the page. It begins in brackets. Every line pretty much, or actually what Adam does is really cool. Each new line is a chapter break or a new chapter. So it's set up very stylistic. AR and I talked about this in our last episode about style choice. And this whole short story is very evident in Adam's style. So it begins in brackets and it says begin, basically chapter 1. And right there, that takes the language of text and it sets the mood. You know it's going to be in the setting of a tape. It immerses the reader to know that they are reading this book as if they were hearing it from what I pictured as like a cassette tape, like an old recording playing that. Also important to note that this takes place in March. It's very significant that month for this story. Or actually describe what this story is about so that way my notes will be more clear as I'm going through it.
All right. Well, what the book is basically about, it is from the point of view of a survivor of a pandemic. So the way that the story is put together, and again, without getting too many into the spoilers, is that a lot of the references, a lot of the story structure is actually mimicked from our own experiences with the pandemic today. So the story takes place 10 years after COVID has wrapped up, which again is actually something that I would like to point out is actually really good in sci-fi. Something I've always bothered me in sci-fi is when people say very specific dates. Like, think about it. Back to the Future, when they went to the future, it was 2016, and they had the hoverboards and shit. We're in 2016. The closest thing we had to hoverboard was a lawnmower that had 2 wheels on it. Ooh. So very obviously, there's a huge gap in between where the technology was hypothesized to be and where it actually was. What I liked about this is that it gave you certain years. Sure, it was 10 years after the pandemic ended, but what is the definition of pandemic end? That could be in however many years from now. And it ended and his pandemic started 10 years after that point. And then the character was born 56 years after the start of that pandemic. So like the point of reference for what the future could be in 20 years, it can be 30 years, it could be 100 years in the future. So that type of ambiguity, I think, is really good for sci-fi just in itself.
Yeah, and it just sets, the mood, the tone, especially because Adam's using a pandemic to set the tone for the story, and it's something that's relating to the audience, so we know those feelings. That's why when I say, it takes place in March, there's already now these connotations and emotions that are attached with the month of March. And so reading it, it's those small details that is totally stylistic. AR, you look like you're about to lose your mind. What do you want to say?
No, honestly, I'm such a man, and I call myself a writer. I actually didn't pick up on the whole thing that it started at March. In March like 13th.
My notes.
Yeah. March 13th. Well, to be fair, I pick up on a lot more like story and world building stuff. I guess I'm an idiot. I had another word in my head, but that's more of a Boston thing. Everybody over here knows what I'm talking about, but
and AR is going to be, like I said, we're going to come together at the end and go deeper into these details. So essentially, yes, Adam is very strong with starting off the mood right from the beginning. You know it's going to be listening from a tape. You know it's going to be pandemic. Begins in March. And like I said, each new tape recording is a new chapter. So it's a very creative way to set up your chapters. In March 13th chapter, the character goes, how can I tell? Damn it, I never was good at M- for being cut off. AR and I talked about M dashes. They're great for when a character is talking and they get cut off. It's that quick, abrupt type of thing. So again, for that dramatic pause, Adam also uses punctuation for pause on March 15th when he goes, so my name, comma, well, comma, it's not really important, comma, is it, question mark. Now, when I'm reading that, it sounds lengthy. I'm sorry, when I'm speaking it, it sounds lengthy, but when you're reading it, it makes sense in your head, and all that punctuation is placed there strategically because characters talking and is questioning whether or not they should give their name because they're recording basically what's happening in this pandemic, which adds to the plot a little bit too in and of itself. Within that same chapter, March 15th, the character says that they're kind of having a Scheherazade. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Scheherazade.
That's
why you should have written it down.
I know.
But anyway.
This character's reading it. Basically, they say, I suppose I'm sort of a reverse Scheherazade, telling the tales and being the audience all at once. Right there, Adam's telling you the trope that he's writing. This is the perspective. It is kind of that apocalyptic type of story, and this is the trope they're taking from a survivor narrator kind of stance. Which is really interesting. A lot of authors won't just straight up tell you their trope. They kind of just play it into the plot. But the way Adam is doing it is like, this is what you can expect from here on. The very end of that sentence, it goes, right, I know, I'm stalling. Character development, you get a taste of the character personality right there. March 19th, we meet a second character, Miranda, and that is when you start to bring in the secondary characters, a little bit about the storytelling, and it tells you the attitude that the main character has, or the relationships that the main character has with the people in their life. On that same side, that sentence ends, if I'm going to do it at all, period, here goes, period. I personally think that's awkward sentencing. Here what goes, here it goes at the very least. It just goes, here goes. But that's the thing. Adam does a lot of rule bending with this dialogue because his entire story is dialogue. It doesn't matter if it's awkward sentencing, if it's somebody speaking. There's so much more free will with that. That was just a personal note that I had taken. And then moving on to the next chapter or section, he goes a little bit deeper into the COVID and the new pandemic that AR was talking about. I just have that's related.
H5N1, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you. H5N1 pandemic is this new pandemic. It's kind of relating to the current audience. Right below that, nobody ever got a good count, meaning the government trying to count the population that's left. Nobody got a good count because sometimes an entire village would just, comma, period, stop. That's character voice and that's plot development. You figure out what's happening in the world aside from this person talking to you on a radio station.
Now, real quick, just to bring together things that we talked about in previous episodes. There is the positive of what Carolyn just spoke about, but there is a negative as well. So just that right there, he was talking about villages. Now, if I was talking about a story about villages, what time frame pops into your head? And I'm not talking about, like, I'm not being redundant. I'm honestly asking you, Carolyn. If I talked a story and said villages, what time frame? Past? No.
Yeah.
If we're talking about 50 to 100 years in the future, why are you referencing a local population as villages? You should be saying cities. Now, I know that's a weird thing because villages exist even in the far future when people have like levitating buildings, things like that. But again, it's things like that we talked about in the last podcast, where it's like that might be true, but that's not where you want to lead your audience down. That's not the path. You should be using phrases and terminology and examples and nouns and pronouns that relate to the time frame in which you're in. Otherwise, it just takes people a little bit out. Yeah, I believe.
No, that's anyway. A good point. I mean, Adam, I know he's not here to defend himself. So in his defense, he could say that because the rest of the world is deteriorating, that the language of the text, for what I call it, might fit. But I see what AR is saying. It does make the reader question what time zone they're in if this is supposed to take place in the future.
Of course, because that's the whole thing, is that there is no prose within this short story. Right. It is just dialogue. So if you're having dialogue, so if you're having dialogue, the entire exposition is being told through the point of view of one character. That right there is point of view, circle and underline, meaning even what you're hearing is a biased opinion, right?
That's a good point.
So everything that you're getting up to that point, it's like you're not even sure, like you're on basically on staggered stilts, like you're on ice basically. You're on a surface that isn't solid to begin with, because you're already starting the plot and the development, the world building from that point. So I don't think you can really have any level of like confusion when it comes to those type of things. Like you need to have everything 100% confined so the author isn't, the reader, the audience isn't getting lost within the world that you're trying to build.
Right.
But even then, I do have to lean into what Carolyn was saying. Dependent on how the world building is for his future. I mean, we're talking about the population, I believe he said went from 7 billion to 50 million. So we're talking about a huge drop in population. So maybe they're called villages just because there's literally so lack of people. So I will give that.
Yeah. And it's a stylistic choice. If it were maybe a more expansive story or wasn't just strictly the way that Adam's writing it from this, perspective, this niche perspective that he's writing, that village wouldn't make sense. But actually, in my next note, I'll get to something else that's similar to that. But I also just want to say, like in that same chapter, I don't know, it's not like, okay, so he is now the main character is referring to his parents, wondering why, they basically brought him into this world. And he goes, I don't know. It's not something we ever talked about. And it's too late to ask them now. I put a note there saying that's character development and exceeding internal conflict. So it's fleshing out that character. And then just to move on to go off what we were just talking about, I'll just read this line. By the time I was ready to start school, there were 11 million people in Tokyo. The city was dead. It just hasn't stopped moving yet. So that's kind of story building / a new norm, something, again, that a term we're familiar with COVID. So it is relating to the characters. Although I was a little confused because it goes, the city is dead. It just hasn't stopped moving. But as the story continues, and I don't know if we'll go super deep into it, but I felt like the world had stopped moving. I mean, with the population dropping and people just like, yes, people are still kind of working, but this person seems like they're just like in their house day in, day out, trying to make this recording. And maybe it was just the way that I had read it, and that's not going to be the same per reader, but I got a different kind of vibe. I felt like the world was falling to shambles, literally.
I mean, again, a population of Tokyo, dropped to 11 million? Tokyo has a huge population.
Right.
So these are huge numbers. I mean, it's not even, we're talking about like worse than like Marvel numbers, like after the snap type of shit. Like we're talking about like more than 50% of people aren't there anymore. You would assume that was in shambles, but I have to say that like I do agree with Carolyn. I actually really like that line because it's like it shows things like that to me are what make really good writing, where you can take a little line like that and like make a whole like college term paper about it. Because in reality, what that thing is talking about is the purveyance of humans. Like even when we're down to our last like 5%, we're still moving. There's still schools. People still work at Starbucks. Like we still keep the charade up, even if we know we're kind of fucked. I actually really like that line. I think it speaks a lot to the genre of what apocalyptic is. Because like I think that's the whole thing. Anytime you watch those movies about apocalypse, about like, you know, like Mad Max type of shit, in our heads, you're like, wait, why don't you just shoot yourself immediately? Why even go through all this goddamn trouble? You know, we're over, like, think about it. We bitch when we get like Wi-Fi, when our Wi-Fi is off, or when we have to deal with in traffic for like 15 minutes longer. These people don't even have water as a guarantee.
Right.
If you teleported me in 2 days, fuck all this bullshit. But like they do it because that's what they're used to. And like Carolyn said, that becomes their norm. Like I don't know. It speaks a lot to what human is in general. Because I'm sure within 100 years, people are gonna look back to what we were doing and be like, oh, how could you? Wi-Fi, oh my God.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it is perspective. It's kind of to change gears too into punctuation, which was in the nitty gritty episode that AR and I talked about last episode. So I'll just read this city. So did I just say I'll read this city because I meant this sentence. There's the word city in this sentence, and I don't know what I just did.
That's how we keep it live here, folks. That's what we're doing. All right.
Yeah, seriously.
That's how you know we're the reals. All right. No bullshit here.
Where was it? All right. Okay. Virgin Galactic, NASA, the CSA, Blue Oregon. Galactic. What did I say?
Galactic. Yeah.
Okay. If they could put, obviously I can't read. They could put a bird in orbit, they were doing it. And then there were the runs from the Port Luna to Luna City, exclamation point after Luna City. Essentially, Adam is like describing all of the different government parts that kind of arose during this time, whether it was before the break of this pandemic, during this new pandemic, or after, just kind of like giving world building. So he's describing that. But what I want to focus on is he puts an exclamation point after Luna City. It's interesting because it's an exclamation point, so you know you're supposed to read it excitedly. And because this is completely in dialogue, the narrator can't explain the feelings of this immersive first perspective. So you kind of just need to put that explanation point there and hope that the reader gets it. You can't explain like, you know, I exclaimed or I said excitedly as these feelings were rushing up my spine or whatever it is, because nobody talks like that. So we put an explanation point in there for that mood, for that emotion, for that emphasis, things that AR and I talked about in our last episode. So again, it's just another rule bending. It's not necessarily lazy writing like AR and I talked about when over punctuation is lazy writing. Adam places them in here kind of throughout.
Stylistic choice, as we said.
Yes, stylistic choice, basically. So I just want to point that out, that because this is all dialogue, there's probably going to be more punctuation like explanation points in there, or capitalization, which Adam does put in here, when you cannot write it out because it would conflict with the narrative or with the point of view. So you got to basically look at it and pick the lesser of the two evils, which I think Adam did correctly here. As I said, each section is a new chapter break rather than writing out different chapters. Adam puts M dashes throughout here for the dramatic effect. I also felt too, leading from the M dash to the next chapter, we're now on March 20th, and the sentence goes, though I miss her birthdays now and then, you won't believe and it gets cut off with an M dash for effect. Next chapter, March 21st. Sorry, I had to stop. I didn't know she was listening that closely. And well, let's not talk about it. So originally I had put, that's a plot development. That's a subplot development. Somebody is listening into him talking. You know, what does that mean? Why do you have to stop? Why does he care who listens if it's, say, his wife, girlfriend, whoever he's living with? But it never actually got finished. So I put another parenthesis in there where I put unfinished. It seems like it's a plot development, but it never concludes of why they had to stop abruptly from talking. Maybe it was just for the pacing of the story. Maybe it's not that big of a detail. Just something to note, that if you kind of put an M dash something after something, it's a dramatic effect. And then if you don't wrap it back up or kind of come back to it or make it evident why it was in there, it leaves me as a reader a little bit confused. Like, why was it such a big deal when it happened? And then it was unfinished. So I'm taking note of that there.
To add to that, because I think it's actually one of those things that it's really, I actually think it's decent writing, but I don't think it worked here.
Mhm.
So the whole thing about this is that, like I said, you are on staggered stilts already. You're on ice. You can't be throwing people frozen fish while they're on ice. You can't be throwing random things that are going to detract you from the plot, especially when you haven't like built the full, like you're literally building the world as you're talking. It's not that you build the world in the beginning and then the characters start like inhibiting it after. You're literally building it with dialogue as the person is explaining things. Yeah. So a little thing like that, I think is just too much of a distraction. But to play devil's advocate on my own point here, I do think it's actually pretty good, because if you think about it from the character's point of view. Imagine me and you were like fucking in a relationship, and I'm over here talking to a camera, talking about like, oh yeah, Carolyn is really annoying sometimes, and I realize that you're listening in the corner like, oh shit, I gotta go. That's what he meant it as. It was like the natural thing of being in a relationship. It's not like a person was spying on him as much as it was like, I think he was basically building the world that he's in a relationship.
I guess, but I felt that because the world is so eerie, honestly, like that's the tone and mood that I'm getting from this story, that anything like that, and it's because this is such a short story, I feel like you have to be super intentional with that. That's just what I think, because there's room for like little stuff that don't necessarily have to be explained, but when it's his relationship, basically the only other character that's like really mentioned, almost like a second main character, I just feel like it felt like it was going to be something important because of all of these minor things surrounding the story itself. And then when it didn't finish, I was just kind of like, I didn't cry over it. It was nothing like that deep, but it was just something like I noticed it.
It was a tease. It was like, it was like whatever analogy you want to use, a frozen fish being thrown at you. Like, it was just, I think it was glaring.
Yeah.
Especially like he said it at a height of explaining something. Like at the very highest point that he was about to explain something that you as a reader is like, all right, finally, we're about to get some juice here. Is he goes like, oh, wait a minute, my wife's talking shit. 1 second.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, what are you talking about?
Again, stylistic choice.
But again, I do like devil's advocate, like going deeply into what we were talking about in the last episode. And again, nitty gritty. If you haven't watched that last episode, check it out. But one of the main things that everything is stylistic choice. So while we're looking at it in a certain point of view, all those things could be intentional. And we're just like, maybe we're not the specific audience for it. So again, these are things you have to find out by yourself. Read the short story, support the authors. And if you feel differently about it, comment, tell us. I love being told I'm an idiot. I'll be talking to a therapist about that for the rest of my life. But for whatever reason, exactly. It makes us a good, decent co-host. I know Carolyn's the same way. She's a weirdo. Mm-hmm. But going off of what we were talking about, and I know Carolyn kind of glazed over it, but the whole thing about the chapter breaks is that it literally goes, it starts from March 13th, and every entry is, we even double checked it because we thought that there might have been a little bit thing, but he actually did it perfectly. It goes from March 13th all the way down to, I think, April 7th, I believe, and it goes through every single day as there was a journal entry. May 6th, are you right? I'm not even gonna argue. I fully believe you.
It goes in order.
Fully believe you. But wait, is it April, March? Oh, because March is after. You see?
This is why.
I'm an idiot. Anyway, so it goes from March 13th, and you see how I'm actually holding something like I'm a weather person. It goes from March 13th all the way down to whatever month she was talking about, May 7th. And wow, so we really have 2 M months right after one another. So boring. You talk about lazy writing. But anyway, it goes down through all those entries, and when there's not an entry, it says no entry.
Right.
Now this is a double-edged sword.
I want to finish these notes first. We're gonna get to the very end. We're almost there. Just because that's gonna be, I know you're going with this. Anyways, I'm cutting you off. Okay, Adam also put some foreshadow in here, or what I thought to be foreshadow. He goes, suddenly all these little places started turning up empty, and not just at the coast, but further inland too. So I say maybe that was foreshadow, as if that all these places are going to start disappearing. I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to spoil it right now, but it was kind of a foreshadow that shit's disappearing. I mean, he mentions that earlier too. So the foreshadowing could have been seeded a little earlier. I just didn't catch it until this specific sentence. But talking about things turning up empty, disappearing, not just the coast, and the coast is a huge part. It's one word in this sentence, coast, but it's huge in the story later on. So that was some foreshadowing there, very subtle, and that's a good thing with foreshadowing. You don't want it to be so glaring that it's obvious to the reader. It leaves for a plot twist, essentially.
And I just have to throw in a hat real quick here. That was honestly, I think, my favorite part of the short story. Because to me, and it goes back to what we talked about with our genres and tropes episode. And again, go back, listen to that if you haven't. But to me, I think that was an introduction of a new genre. Up until that point, we were basically given, I guess, sci-fi dystopian comedy. That was the type of genre that was leading towards it. And then the introduction of just that one line introduced thriller and mystery. Because now it's like everything that we had heard about the pandemic. And again, I think that's why he chose to model it so closely to what we're going with the COVID. And why he even references COVID specifically in order to like kind of parallel between that and the pandemic that they're going through now that affected, you know, to
Right.
a ninth degree, the world that he's in, that he's building. I think the whole reference, the whole parallel for that, well, I think was just really, it was really strong, honestly. And I think that was actually a really good thing that he did. And just the way that he built that little plot line, that little world building that he did, I think that was actually very well executed.
Yeah.
Because it was just that one line introduced a whole new genre. A whole new genre. Like everything that you had heard up until that point was just like basically information being told to you. Like if you're at a bar with a person from the future, oh, by the way, let me tell you what fuck happened to me last week. It was that type of shit. And all of a sudden it turned into like, ooh, wait a minute. What's happening now? Where's this third element coming from?
Yeah. Yeah. And literally the pacing of Adam's story, it's fast. So literally on the next page, you reap that plot twist. But right before that, the beginning of the paragraph, I just want to point out too that Adam says, so it seems that the government knew the where, all caps, pass or part almost immediately, but didn't tell anyone. I don't know if that's because they didn't know the why, all caps. A little like this thing here, he's using the capitalization because obviously, like we said 100 times, it's all dialogue. You cannot explain the emphasis when you're writing all dialogue because nobody talks like that. So this is one of the times where I think all cap works. And it makes sense for the story. It flows, there's no question about it. So yes, that's a note that I had. The plot twist that we were talking about, they probably knew this in the first couple of days where everyone had gone into the oceans. So like I mentioned, coasts in that sentence above, like ocean coast, ocean floor, people just disappearing. I was like, all right, something's building here. The twist is that people are straight up walking into the ocean. So it's not just people are disappearing. I mean, they are, but now we kind of know where they're going. They're not getting like sucked from the sky by aliens. Like, no, they're going to the ocean. They're going underground, not above ground. So that's that. Adam also does play on words with the plot, as I call it. When he's describing the people walking into the ocean, he goes, no hesitation, no fear, no nothing. Young, old, female, male, doesn't matter. All of them with this blank look on their face, like nobody's home. So I said that's play on words with the plot because, earlier in the book, he's describing that people just disappear from their homes. People, like villages are disappearing. A lot of houses are empty. So he references like the place of home quite a lot throughout his story. And then right here, when he's describing the look on people's faces as they're disappearing, it's like nobody's home. So it's a really good way to play on words with your plot, like A&R and I talked about in our I think nitty gritty episode, where it's not lazy writing. You actually take the time to just subtly describe what your characters are feeling, and double points if you can make it relate to themes in your story. And Adam does that right there in like 3 letters, or 3 words rather. So that is that. Kind of just goes on. I have more things just about punctuation, all capitalization, but they're pretty much all of the same. The story starts to wrap up, and Adam does this with words that allude to time. So it starts with 2 weeks ago, 1 sentence, last week, 1 sentence, yesterday, 1 sentence. that kind of is like the breakdown when you know you're reaching the end of the story, minus by just the page count. But he actually takes a way to slow down the story and to kind of tie things together. Stylistic choice with pacing and timing. And then essentially we get to what AR was talking about before I rudely cut him off, where it just goes into no entry, no entry, no entry. And basically that's the end of the story. Just no entry. The guy eventually goes into the ocean himself. That's the end. He disappears. So I have some notes about the ending, but I know I've been talking a lot, so I'm just going to let AR kind of spit out whatever he wants about this.
So when it comes to the character development, when it comes to what the character is saying, how the character speaks, there's a lot of stylistic choices that Adam did that, as we talked about earlier, actually worked very well for the plot, the type of emotions that he was trying to convey, the tone. But there are certain things that I believed were overused. So for an example of it would be, you know. Now, to be honest, people do very naturally speak like that. But I think that is one of the things, like I remember one of the edits that my editor gave me in the first round was like, I like that you're making your dialogue seem as close to human dialogue and how people talk as possible, but you're overusing it. Just because 14-year-olds use like every 3 sentences doesn't mean that your character should do that, because you still have to have a person read through that. That's annoying as shit to read. The same way it's annoying as shit to hear. But we don't say anything because it's normal conversation with a person. It's not written down. You can't, there is no editing. We're having a regular conversation. If you had the option to edit it, I promise you would take out the like and the ums. Yeah. So like, and this, I just said it right there. Perfect. Ooh, what's up? DAP. What do you want? Full fruition within 3 seconds. If I had the option, I would take that out. Believe me. So when it comes to writing down your prose, your character, your dialogue, those are the type of things that, for as much as you want to represent or representation of how your characters talk, overuse of it is too much. 1 or 2 you knows would have been perfect. It would have slid in perfect. Now there's one that I actually really want to bring into question, which is in reference to a character, what we would call character development. He's talking about how basically the population went down, thusly the government had to push for people to start procreating, as one would assume, because you need to have, you need to start repopulating the earth, right? There is one time that he says, and again, this is just a one little line here, which again, I think is what true beautiful writing is, where you can encompass the entire almost human element, the whole human experience in one line and just leave it there. But what Adam says that, and masterfully, he says, we tried for a while and then we kept on trying, but still had hope. And then we eventually lost hope. I guess having kids wasn't for us. That one little line right there speaks to so much of just the pain, the suppression of pain. Because I believe that if it was a different type of character that was maybe a little more emotionally developed, they would have talked about their pain a little bit more. How depressive it is to not only, I mean, people feel that way now, and we're overpopulated. Imagine having a failure of being able to procreate during a time where procreation is literally essential for the continuity of the human race. That's what's crazy. All the pain and the pressure of that, those 2 lines perfectly convey those emotions. Those are heavy emotions to convey, period. And Adam was able to do that masterfully with 2 lines. So that is definitely something to highlight. But at the same time, you need to choose and pick your battles. If you try to press that knob too often, then it loses impact. You need to know how to do it in a certain way. Drop it at a certain time so that it really is impactful. And again, going back to what we talked about before, you don't, for as good as comic relief is, you don't want to end a sentence like that with a, oh, by the way, let me go hang out with my wife is talking about. Hey, you know what I'm talking about? That is going to take away from what the emotion you just conveyed out of me. So you need to gradually take it down and then hit me with some comic relief and then go on to the next point.
And I kind of want to go into what you were talking about with keeping that consistency through the story. and again, I'm not here to trash Adam's work or anything like that, but I noticed a little bit of some inconsistencies with the story because just like if their character, he says he's 56, 57 years old, I didn't feel like he talked like he was that age. Given I am not 56, 57, so I'm not really want to judge, I guess, how people of that age talk, and everybody talks differently, but it didn't feel like that age. This whole time I felt like I was reading from the perspective of somebody like 20s or whatever. I also felt a little bit inconsistent too, because in the beginning of the story, the main character says, "Oh, this is so stupid. I shouldn't make these tapes. Whose idea was this?" And he goes, "Oh, mine. I guess I should do it." But then, like, a few pages later, he says that Miranda keeps pushing him to make the tapes and I should just, sit my ass down, finish making it, all of that. So it's kind of like who wanted to make the tapes. And we also never learned why whoever's idea was to make the tape. We never learned whose idea it really originally was, because there's kind of back and forth with that. But then we also never really learned why these tapes were made in the first place, which, like, I would have liked to see, like, what was the point of this? What was this guy trying to do? Like, who was he talking to if the population kept dropping? Was it just to, like, any survivors? Was it to a government place for rescue? Was it, like, I have no idea. So that was one of the things that I thought was another, like, inconsistent. There was one more thing as well. I'm just going to go back up, see if I can find it. Bear with me. I might not have it. It might not be. Oh, another thing inconsistent was, again, with the language of text type of thing. When the main character talks about, like, there's no more news. I can get all the reruns of movies I want. AR and I agree that was a little bit out of date, because if this takes place so far in the future, like, cable TV probably really isn't around anymore. It's all streaming devices. The same way with this recording device, we don't really know what they're recording on. I, like, in the beginning said maybe it's a cassette tape of a sort, which would be super outdated. Those are already, like, outdated. So just some issues with, like, the time frame, more or less. And, like, the villages, like AR had pointed out, like, that language of text that, again, needed to be in the future for this plot to work with the pandemic. But I just felt like the language of text, some of it was a little bit not consistent, which isn't a huge deal. That can be easy fixes.
Oh yeah, I mean, a super highlight here. Everything that we're talking about are pretty easy fixes. I mean, these are things that are no problem. We're just the only reason we point them out is so that you know what to avoid. These are the actual, potholes that you're like, actual plot holes that you want to think about driving that you're trying to cruise over here. Little things that could just take a person out of it. Well, if you're in the future and you're talking about villages, kind of give an explanation as to why villages would be the forefront here, especially if you're talking about impact. I mean, saying cities are emptying out is like, it's like, oh shit, cities contain a few million people and those are being emptied out. What the fuck is that? That's pretty fucking scary. And very much so with all the technology as well. I mean, there's 1,000 different ways that there were just different references. They're talking about the streaming versus cable TV, the villages, all things that are easy to fix. And if a fix like that would really just update the entire genre, well, not even the genre, but just the time frame and the setting.
Right. I know AR and I also talked about, we were wondering who's the audience. Again, not only why are these tapes being recorded, but who's listening to these tapes. Obviously, us as the readers in present time, that's who the story is for. But for the sake of the character in the story, like, who are they trying to talk to? I don't know. AR brought up the audience point, but I think it's kind of an important one. That's a question you should always be asking yourself, who is my audience, things like that.
And to lean on that a little bit more, like what?
Yeah, go ahead.
The whole thing with the audience is, like, when you're speaking, you have to understand, like, why and who you're speaking to. So, for example, let's say that I were to write down a short story of me explaining my experiences of COVID to Carolyn. Now, I would have to get into detail about certain local things that happen maybe around my city, my town, but I wouldn't have a 5-minute breakdown of what an iPhone is, because she knows what an iPhone is, because she's from my generation, she's from my time frame. There were a lot of times that I picked up on that Adam would glaze over things that probably would be kind of like that you actually would explain to a person because they probably wouldn't know that aspect of it. Like if you're talking to like the character, I believe was like an actual scientist working with governmental agencies. Like he actually had like probably a high level of clearance. And there were certain things that he glazed over that probably the normal human wouldn't know of, that you probably actually could have went into a little more explanation of. But then there were things that he went into detail about that, like, I think if he was talking to a person of that generation, of that time frame, it would be kind of redundant.
Right.
If I even just started talking about how an iPhone works to Carolyn, she'd be like, I also have one, buddy.
Yeah.
We can stop
Like,
this right now.
it was in there because we as the readers
Exposition dump. Exactly. But that's one of those things that, like, it's almost like what we were talking about in plot development, episode like 3. That is whiteboard shit. Before you even get down to writing, that's when you start putting the circles and making those Gantt charts of what the information is, what the character is, and how the entire structure of the thing goes. Now, I'm not trashing the entire structure.
Right.
I'm just saying that, like, in order for it to completely flow in a certain way, I think that's one of those things that should have been handled in the inception of the writing.
And I also then just want to add my final note for the ending, that I thought it was a semi-conclusive ending, and I think that's the point with this genre. Anything apocalyptic, always open-ended. How do you really even end those, like, on a happy note, so to say? But it was semi-conclusive because we know what happened to the character. We know he just had to go. Basically, what happened with everybody else that just had to go into the ocean, and that's kind of it. No explanation of like why, and that's kind of like that eeriness from it. So we know what happened to the character. We don't know the why, but sometimes we don't always get that in a story. A lot of times authors do. That's a very creative stylistic choice. So again, that was a stylistic choice that Adam went with for the ending, semi-conclusive, but also ending is alluded to the entire time. Throughout the whole story, Adam's telling you, people are just disappearing. People are leaving city, villages, population is constantly dropping. Like, he is seeding his plot throughout the entire time. Yet it's still kind of a shock when you're like, when it's no entry, the character just gets up and leaves. But Adam tells you the entire time the population is dropping. So very creative and very subtle planning those things through there. So I thought that was like really well done.
Agreed.
Even if you don't like these types of endings, but you have to appreciate the detail that kind of went behind it, like the subtleness. So I really liked that. I thought that was really good.
And to add to that, it was something that Carolyn was talking about before we hit record. But even the passages themselves, they literally grow over time. So, like, I think the passage for like March 19th, which is the first time that he really starts like giving like long answers for things, is significantly smaller than the passage for like March 23rd, and that one is even smaller than the passage for March 27th. So I think that makes sense, because if you have a character, literally the short story starts off with basically how the character does not want to do this and is doing it out of coercion, basically, from his partner. Right. So going off that idea, right? Just the fact the character is getting more comfortable with it, I think that's a natural human progression. If a person is shy, that first entry is going to be small, but as they continue getting a little more used to it, being in front of a camera, talking about your experiences, opening up a little bit to a person that may or may not actually be there, I think you're responsible to naturally grow a little bit longer. And Adam conveyed that perfectly, which again is definitely something to highlight. But just to give a little bit of the snake bite, I do think that the whole thing of the no entries that started and began the short story, I think were a tad bit redundant. I think the exact emotion that was conveyed with saying no entry for 8 days in a row could have been conveyed with 2 and then end. Same thing with the beginning of the short story, where it was like him just saying like, oh, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this for like 7 days. You could have had it once and then skip to the actual day that he started,
right?
And it would have conveyed the exact same emotion.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And I think both could work, definitely. But it's that writer's choice. It's that pacing, what you want for your story. Just because it's a short story doesn't mean it has to go rapid fire either. And I think I'm not Adam, but I think maybe that's why he did it, to kind of try to build the story a little bit where he can. I don't know. I mean, again, that's just kind of like writer's choice. AR's writing is very quick paced. I mean, his book is much bigger than the story, but it's faster paced. So it just kind of goes to show that in writing books, that all of these different elements you can mix and match. You can have a long form writing with long pacing. You can have long form writing with rapid pacing. You can have a short story, long pacing. It's kind of like a poem, actually, I guess. But you get the point that it doesn't have to be done exactly this way and only this way. Yeah, that's why we keep saying writer's choice, writer's choice. But essentially, thank you so much, Adam. I mean, I enjoyed reading this, and I think it was like really good for us to break through. It was short enough for us to kind of basically read through your entire story and give line to line notes.
Which is why it may seem that this critique is like very like dived in, but it's only so because the entire thing is about 3,500 words. So we had the option of being able to do that. When we start reviewing for season 2, when we review larger works, I do believe our next work is going to be about 70,000. So when it comes to that, it's going to be a lot more overarching writing. But this one, we were able to really dive down like quite literally line by line. Yeah, exactly.
So keep that in mind if you do want to submit work to me in AR for us to critique it. If you just want overarching themes, send us a big piece of work. If you want this line to line work, send us, 3,500 words.
Yeah. Right. Especially short stories to me, I mean, the reason I love the medium so much is because I feel it's the medium between poetry and novelization, where you really have the option of making each line just as impactful as the entire passage. So I think a thing like that, especially just me, I really narrowed down on certain things. So definitely, from the bottom of my heart, apologies if like anything was being like offended, but like I only was, and more so, who am I? Do I have like, where am I recording right now? Am I recording from a penthouse? The fuck do I know? I'm literally just giving you my opinion, and even my opinion could be hella off. Right. I'm just saying that from where I stood, I fully, honestly agree with what I was saying before. But that, like, who am I? What point of view am I going off of here? And same thing for Carolyn. No offense. I mean,
it's true.
This is just our opinion here. Really take it with a grain of salt. And even then, salt is really bad for you. It like absorbs water. I'd be careful. It's low sodium diet. I got to keep my waist trim for the summer.
Yes. So thank you, Adam.
But thank you, Adam.
On top of that, for letting us critique your work, even though our opinion doesn't mean shit. Thank you.
and on top of that, I mean, like for everything that we talked, I mean, we read through it and we enjoyed it. So at the end of the day, isn't that what writing is? If I picked up fucking The Son of Neptune, the Rick Riordan book, bestseller like 1,000 times over, best thing ever. If we tore that apart, I'm sure we could find a couple things to talk shit about. You can talk shit about any writing ever in life.
Oh my God.
But at the end of the day, it's all about entertainment.
Yeah.
And that book, and that short story was 100% entertaining. So for that, hats off. It gets the Authors Anonymous seal of approval. You got a high five from me. Carolyn is gonna send you a used sock or some bullshit like that. I don't know. You ask her. That's all about her. I'm gonna send you a picture of me doing this.
Yeah.
Poor Adam. It will crack your screen if you open it up on an iPhone. I suggest, but that is the end of this podcast, episode 9.
Yeah, season pre-finale. So next time, season finale. Woo! I'm excited.
And that is gonna be the true crux of everything. So episode 1 through 8 were tips. Episode 9 was the correlation of those tips and actually using it to critique a fellow author's work. Episode 10 is going to be taking all those things, and even the things that we trashed about, and actually converting it into a little short story.
Yes.
In order to actually bring together everything here.
Right. We critique, and then we're going to basically take our own advice, like a taste of our own medicine. So don't think we're just doing this, we'll dish it, but we won't take it. We're not like that. So that'll be next episode.
Yes, very much so. And we're going to put that together. And on top of that, it's going to be both of us writing it. Yeah. It's not like that's going to be the fun part here. It's also going to be almost a trial of the idea of like too many cooks in the kitchen. So we're going to find all these things out, and that is next week. Folks, you gotta stay tuned. Authors Anonymous. You already know the deal. with Carolyn Rosa Pops.
And they are Mirabal.
Check with us next week, next Tuesday. You already know the deal. Peace